Hello, everyone. It's Tai Pleasant sitting here with Dr. Shannon O'Lear, and welcome, everyone. So, my first question to you, Dr. O'Lear, is how would you define environmental justice or environmental racism?
So I I tend to think of it more like the environmental injustice is really what we're talking about are the injustices that draw our attention. And I think we see it when we notice how we're overlooking the ways in which some groups of people experience compounded vulnerabilities or disadvantages based on how that group of people is defined, labeled, and overlooked by mainstream or dominant decision makers. And I think it's important to note that oftentimes when we talk about a group of people, I think what is particularly harmful is when they're labeled or identified outside of themselves, like another group of people or society or policy or law is looking at them saying, these people, and we've put them in a group, whether or not, they want to be in that group. So I think that's kind of where it starts, is when we start labeling groups of people like this.
Well, thank you. All right, question number two. Sorry to.
Oh, you know what? I do have a thought on environmental racism. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And let me give you an example also. So, because you had asked about an example of environmental injustice, and in my class the other day, we were talking about climate anxiety. That's something that a lot of folks are talking about now, is climate anxiety. And we were talking about the ways in which climate anxiety overlooks the fact that there are many people who already have a lot of anxieties based on what is happening in society, what is happening with them personally, what kind of barriers are being thrown up on their paths. So climate anxiety tends to be, it's sort of the same problem you have a lot of environmentalism tends to be a pretty white and somewhat privileged movement. From that perspective, I think that can also overlook a lot of the built-in injustices in society and the anxiety that some people already have. So there's that. I wanted to give you that example. And I think for environmental racism, I think this is what we're talking about are unfortunately affecting people of color, or places where people of color are the majority. So for example, urban infrastructure that is or was built in a way that puts neighborhoods where people of color are the majority at greater risk or harm without equal benefits of that infrastructure. That's a lot of words, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am. It does. My internet's getting unstable since we're on the bus, so I turned my video off because it's helping me, I guess, streaming a little bit better. I might still be. Hopefully, it's working for you. All right, I'm just gonna keep moving because I can hear you.
Yep, that's fine. I'm still just fine.
All right, and then I guess my next question is, what are the biggest reasons the environmental justice movement hasn't gone mainstream besides the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement?
So when I read this question from you, Tahim, my first question back was, who are the people who are steering environmental activism? Like, who decides what gets attention? And I think we might look to journalism or climate communication in the media. These are things that I think, why hasn't it gotten more attention in the public? I think that's because what is the public exposed to? What are they seeing? And who's kind of in charge of that? And what I want to do is send you, I don't have it in my notes yet, but I'll put it in there. I want to send you a link to, it's called The Good Energy, and it's a climate playbook for Hollywood screenwriters. And it's how do we integrate climate change and concerns about climate change in Hollywood without making it all like the whole movie is the day after tomorrow and everybody's freezing to death. How do we work in the fact that climate change is part of all of these other conversations that we're having? How do we work that into our character development or our plot development And it also points out some ways that the fossil fuel industry, just like product placement in movies, ways that some of the major industries have been able to sort of influence the narratives that we see in mainstream media and in movies. And, you know, once you see it, you can see it for what it is. So I'm going to put that link in here, and maybe you can also look into that, because they do have some things on environmental injustice in there and how do we treat that in mainstream communication. So that might be used.
Yes, I'd like to take a look at that. Thank you. Our final question for you is, what is the future of EJ, environmental justice?
And I'm so infuriating because, again, I have more questions for you. My question back at you is where? Like, are you talking about Lincoln, Nebraska? Are you talking about Warren, Kansas? Or
I read this interesting article for this literature review, and they ended in like South Africa, and they were talking about like the government kind of building housing in like a just way, because the government's building housing, I guess, in South Africa. And they were zooming out instead of looking at the national, regional level. She's kind of looking at the local and regional level. So maybe if you can explain maybe how it's going to look in the future. Do you think there would be more neighborhood research and more like local instead of trying to start the national level? Because it doesn't always trickle down to us.
well, and that's a really good point. And this is what I would say, is at what scale can environmental justice activism or policy intervention really be effective? And I think we see this with urban scale climate resilience plans, that a lot of cities, at least in the US and I think elsewhere as well, have plans for various forms of climate resilience, or things that they're trying to do to make them more robust in the face of a storm or extreme weather event, or they're trying to reincorporate different kinds of land into their city plan. But I think it's city by city, people are taking a look and saying, what can we do? How can we make things more equitable or fair or just? But I think you're right that doing that at the national level, it's not as effective as these local efforts. So like the example you gave, I would agree with.
I want to know your opinion of like maybe like racial segregation in housing and like the kind of the impact or the environmental concerns of that.
Well, right. I mean, this is like the legacy issue, right? Of redlining and how cities developed, and how you sort of really forced a lot of people onto a track where they weren't going to get the same level of wealth, or they weren't going to have the same advantages as the cities. And you sort of bifurcated the population there, but you expect everybody to, you know, behave the same or enjoy it the same amount, which it's just not going to happen. Or we look at like even the kinds of things where we have tree planting programs that tend to favor already wealthy neighborhoods and not the neighborhoods that probably really need the benefits of more green space. So we even now, not only is it the segregation and the redlining, but now it's like patterns of gentrification and which neighborhoods are getting investment projects. And, you know, then that attracts more wealthy people in, and the folks who've already lived there may not be able to afford to stay there. So it's like an ongoing process that not only is going on, it's just adding layer after layer. And I think it's really important that you're asking this question, because I think those are places that we could really focus attention in, like urban planning and these kinds of disciplines, geography, obviously, as well, to try to adjust how those things are unfolding in particular places.
Christina Culwick, Fatti, and I am a senior researcher at an organization called the Gauteng City Region Observatory, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. And my research looks at urban, environmental, and social issues. And I'm particularly interested in how social justice and environmental sustainability intersect.
All right, thank you. All right, Christina, I'm gonna ask you the first one. All right. How would you define environmental justice or environmental racism?
So the idea around environmental justice, and I suppose environmental racism is a subcomponent of environmental justice, is where like environmental ills or negative environmental impacts are disproportionately felt and the burden of which are borne by the most vulnerable in society. And so the idea behind environmental justice is saying, well, we need to take a look at how our negative environmental consequences exacerbate existing deprivation, and we need to look at how to counteract that, essentially. And the idea behind environmental racism is typically understood that a lot of the people who are disproportionately affected by environmental ills are people of color. And that's seen across the entire world at different scales. I know a lot of the recent like news around this type of thing has identified specific places in the States. But if you want to think globally in regards something like the climate change impacts, you could argue that the people broadly who are going to be most affected, but who are also least responsible for climate change, are people of color across the globe. So people within Asia, people within Africa, and yeah, so the idea of environmental racism is a useful thing to understand the particular way that environmental justice can affect different race groups, and how, I suppose, in some ways the example of climate change can be thought that's and I think more generally that the people who are most likely to have caused or led to the environmental degradation ills are typically white, and people who tend to bear the burden tend to be people of color. Problem.
So I read, so this next question I got because I read your article, Towards Just Sustainability Through Government-Led Housing and Conceptual Practical Considerations. So the next question I ask you is, what are some proactive approaches scholars and policymakers could take to facilitate just housing across South Africa and the United States?
Sure. This is it's a really pertinent, really important question. I think the idea of just and sustainable housing is going to be something that's very context specific. So I'm going to let you and your class grapple with the ideas around just housing in the States, and I'll specifically just speak about some of the key considerations related to housing in South Africa. I think one of the things that's really critical in South Africa is to understand how access to housing is really fundamentally tied to South Africa's transition to democracy and the broader understanding of the need to redress the inequalities that linger through from apartheid, and that housing is in some ways a means towards improving access to not just house but broader infrastructure and broader services and economic opportunities. And I think that one of the things that's that I've focused quite deliberately on is thinking more broadly about housing as a means to access opportunities. And if we're going to think about justice in terms of housing, we can't just say, okay, well, people who don't have housing need to be given a house or need to be supported in getting a house. Because what we found in South Africa is that the provision of housing, when the idea is, well, we'll give you a house and so your life will be better, what we found is that people might have better living conditions, but they have no opportunities to get themselves out of out of poverty, and essentially the houses typically are really far away from economic opportunities, and the transport costs are prohibitive in them being able to access job opportunities, or even just look for job opportunities. So I think the idea around like how do we build and how do we contribute towards just and sustainable housing is to think, I think, quite strategically about what the house is able to do, and what do people who are in need of better shelter and infrastructure and access to basic services, what is that house able to provide? And if we think differently, then like, well, we're giving you shelter, so things will be a bit different. To be able to say, okay, well, actually, what is the most strategic way that we can improve access to shelter, as well as the other range of benefits? I think what's also really important is to understand that while justice considerations typically focus at the poorest groups, some of the key sustainability shifts actually need to be taken by the elite groups. And if we're going to shift our societies to a more sustainable and more equitable trajectory, in a system that is more inclusive and sustainable, we're not just going to be able to do that by raising the quality of life of the poorer groups, but we're also going to need to take a look at how the elite groups and how the middle and upper income are typically shaping our cities in ways that benefit them and are typically not sustainable. And so we need to take a look at both elements within the housing system.
Thank you, Christina. That's a good answer. All right, now the final question for you is, what is the future of environmental justice?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that's been happening recently that's come through from the environmental justice debates is the idea of a just transition, and I think that's something that's we've seen quite a lot in South Africa. So the idea of a just transition came through originally from within the labor movement around environmental justice, and the idea that in our shift towards sustainable industries and shifting away from high carbon intensive industries, there's going to be an impact in the labor, those who provide labor to those unsustainable industries. And our shift towards sustainability mustn't negatively affect the labor groups who really are not the causal are not contributing really to those. They're really just the laborers. And in South Africa particularly, and I think globally, the idea of a just transition is being extended far beyond the idea of labor, and especially now that there's been so much focus on climate change mitigation and shifting the global trajectory of very carbon intensive electricity generation, but broadly the way that our cities and our world works. I think that there's such a huge amount of focus in that direction that builds on some of the environmental justice theory, but has extended it, saying that while environmental justice specifically looks at individual examples and case studies, what it hasn't traditionally done is looked at the systems that cause social injustices and our the negative environmental things. So understanding not just how to address the particular issues within a case study, but to say, how do we redirect our entire system and the underlying trajectories of our economic, political, and social systems that maintain social injustice and environmental sustainability, or environmental issues that then overlap.
Thank you for sharing all this information.